thought I would talk a little bit more about that famous remark of Joshu. What's it all about? It's all about not picking and choosing. One of the reasons is that I was reading in Richard Rohr's Daily Meditations just a day or two ago, and he said, that reminding us that it's not about you, it's not about you or your preferences or about your compulsive reactions. This is good for all of us to remember. It's not about you or your preferences or your compulsive reactions. It's about everyone and everything, about God. So let's look at that a little more closely. Joshu says it's about not picking and choosing. It starts to be a state of, well, what? Where it's not just your preferences or your own desires on a superficial level, but when you're going deeper. It reminds me of St. Ignatius of Loyola's, about whom I spoke in my lectures here last month. His principle and foundation, the basic beacon and standard under which he conducts the spiritual exercise in which we conduct our lives is that we, we're here to, in Christian language, to love and serve God, save our soul, but not to be swayed in one direction or another in our lives simply by our own will or by our own preference. He calls it indifference, the principle of indifference, which sounds terrible and apathetic and all, but that's the point. That is the point. You're at a point, centered in reality and open, so that you're not swayed in one direction or another by in your daily choices and in your actions and in your reactions and in your thoughts and feelings by your own preferences. And that's the point of it, so that you're not, simply, on this ego level of knee-jerk reaction or preference, but on a deeper level of alignment with everything, as we just heard, and as both Zen and Christianity would say. Now that's different from what the Christian Catholic ascetical tradition had emphasized, in some currents, kind of a Jansenistic current, the very ascetical current, the severe current that I was raised in, where in religious life, I actually heard this expression used, I think it was in the Jesuits, you take the novice, the one who comes in, and you want to break their will, which sounds like, getting them out of their own preferences, but it's a whole different context here. It's not opening out to freedom or openness so much as it is to, in the worst case, just dominate somebody and manipulate somebody. But it's really about order. Make sure they're conformed to the institution and to the customs and all of that. So you want to break them so that they're robotic, in the performance. I fit in as a cog in the machine. That's the danger of it anyway. Don't say that that's necessarily what happened. The inspiration, as you see, is valid. You do want to get beyond your own will and your own preferences. But it's not in order to be conformed to any institution or any machine or any, system. On the contrary, to be free of all systems. You can work within a system, but you're not a prisoner of it. Least of all your own inner system, but not any outer system either. Just be free of all of that, otherwise you can't be in touch with everything, which is beyond any system, man-made or otherwise. It's usually men who are making the systems. Males. I tie this very much then. The goal here, I think, is very well articulated by Eckhart Tolle in his book, The New Earth, in which he speaks about our daily activities and the attitude that we must bring to them. How we learn to accept that's the first level, he says. Accept situations as they come to us. So in other words, beyond our own preferences or reactions or desires, accepting things that come to us. Remember, this fits in very well with the Four Noble Truths. The first noble truth of the Buddha is that, life is insufficiency, inadequate. It doesn't always conform, luckily for us, doesn't always conform to our own desires or preferences, etc. But that, our reaction to clinging or desiring is what causes our human suffering. That we don't react, as we should to situations as they arise. So that the first noble truth, as it's translated here, is, birth, decay, sickness, death, the very things that the Buddha reacted to in his own life, to enable him to wake up and to formulate this truth. He says, to be joined with what one dislikes, dukkha, suffering. To be disjoined from what one likes. To have what one doesn't like, not to have what one does like, suffering. That's the situation we find ourselves. Not to get what one wants. See, that's the problem. And the problem, as you see here, is not that we don't get what we want, or we're separated from what we do want, we get what we don't want, but our reaction to it. Why are we wanting it to begin with? And that's what Eckhart Tolle says. We're getting beyond ego wanting, is what he says. Very much along those same lines. We get beyond our egos, in other words, our superficial self, our false self, wanting or not wanting or preferring this or that, and that we learn to accept, first level, as I said, as he says, first level of acceptance of a situation as it is. It may be unpleasant by our standards, not what we want, but there has to be at least an initial acceptance of it before we can do what we need to do with it, a first level of acceptance. But then, he says we should go on to, and can go on to a second level, which is enjoyment. And enjoyment of a situation is simply what happens whenever you're open to something as it is, just as it is, and you're taking it as it is. So it might be something initially unpleasant by your standards, but if you're truly present to it, there's a certain level of joy which begins to and it, maybe apart from the unpleasant elements, but then you come to a deeper level where you learn to appreciate, even enjoy what's actually there. And he makes an excellent point. He says it's not so much you enjoy what you're doing. The joy comes from what you're doing. The joy flows into you from a deeper source into your action. It's a very insightful point. So it's not so much that you enjoy what you're doing, whatever it is, that the joy comes from the doing. But it precedes that. The joy comes from being open to a higher source, which then flows into the action and brings joy. He says it's being conformed to the creative energy of the universe. In his terms, the Holy Spirit, or whatever you call it, that from a higher source you're getting you're in tune. You're in tune with the whole. As Richard Moore said a moment ago, you're in just about everybody and everything, and God, you're in tune with a higher reality, which is exactly what St. Ignatius was getting at, right? When he was saying, let's be in tune with the Spirit, let's be in tune with what God wants in our life, and that's when we can begin to really wake up to our life and see clearly what we're called to do. And that brings us to the third part that Eckhart Tolle brings out. He says you can even go beyond enjoyment then, in a particular action. As you open up further and further to what your life really is and what you're called to be and to do, then you have enthusiasm. Enthusiasm, because then that opens up to a whole life perspective and a whole life journey. And you really discover who you are in connection to everybody else. All those wonderful definitions of vocation and calling that I like to repeat, that I've heard over the years. Follow your bliss, your true desire, when you're really in tune with everything, with God, the Holy Spirit, or whatever you want to call it, Christian term. When you're being fully alive, as Eckhart Tolle says, when you're enjoying, enthusiastic about something, then the world needs, as one person has said, people who are fully alive. So find out what makes you fully alive and do that in the world. And it will always be, as Eckhart Tolle says, not about your becoming this or that, but about you being able to inspire others and give to others. That's what you'll find to be true life, because that's the life of the whole universe. That compassion, that gift, that love is what it's all about when you truly discover your connectedness to everything. And you'll judge and even begin to prefer, or in terms of that, what here can make me more loving and dynamic person, a more loving and dynamic person. Vocation is where your passion meets the world's need. So find your passion and find how that meets the world's need, and when they come together, that's your calling. And you see, that's your deepest self connected to the whole is what the goal is, whether in Christianity or in Zen or in anything else. Yoga, whatever, it's being connected to the whole and to everyone else. And interestingly enough, that some of you may know that one of the primary goals of the spiritual exercises of St. Ignatius was to help you make what he called the election. Make you, in the midst of your prayer experience, make a life choice about your life's direction and your life's journey. Find your vocation. Of course. Because when you truly are indifferent, truly are connected to Jesus, to reality, to the Buddha, to whatever, to the whole, then you find out who you are and who you are in relation to everything and everyone else, which is we call a vocation. Who knew? So all these systems, work together to awaken us and to alert us to the same thing, ultimately. Even the idea in the book of Genesis that the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, I think esoterically and mystically, should be interpreted not as some particular act of sin of some particular individual, but mythically and mystically as making distinctions and making separations where your own ego can start to manage and fuss and have preferences and manipulate. So that's the real, not a sin so much as a situation in which the ego can easily take over. That's the idea. When you eat of this fruit, of making all these distinctions, the ego easily takes over. So even though we find ourselves scattered in space and time, as I was talking about last week, the now of eternity, you see how that fits in here too, we have to reunite all this in a higher synthesis, get in touch with the tree of life, and life connectedness to everyone and everything, and finding our own deepest life so that we can do this. So I want to conclude by showing a couple of koans precisely on the picking and choosing. And we recently had a series of 3 short koans that followed each other in the Blue Cliff record. And there's one here, likewise, on this koan. I'm actually going to take it backward from 59 to 57, just to get a sense, and you'll see how it fits in. So it's Joshu, as I said, he has monks who are questioning him about his famous saying. They're kind of trying to trap him, is this really what you mean, and how can you mean that? And, typical stuff that teachers have to face. The ultimate path has no difficulties, so just avoid picking and choosing and you won't have any difficulties. So that's it, no picking and choosing. So the monk asks, so as soon as there are words in speech, this is picking and choosing. So he's kind of got the idea, we're using words and concepts, so that's picking and choosing. Have I got you here? Well, this is what he says. Joshu says, why don't you quote the saying in full? The monk said, I thought it only went that far. So Joshu said, it's just this. The ultimate path has no difficulties, just avoid picking and choosing. Well, that's what he just said. How is that quoting it in full? How is it quoting it fuller? Well, the point is, you really get it. That's all there is, but you didn't really quote it because you don't get it. Remember, we had a teisho recently. Ultimate reality is beyond speech or silence. Speech is inadequate, but silence isn't the last word either, the absolute. It's whether in the midst of your everyday life, even in the speech, the ultimate reality is present. So just by the fact of saying a word or a concept doesn't mean you're picking and choosing. You may be totally connected at the same time. Now, the 58th one is somewhat like that. It says, so the monk again quotes that, the ultimate path has no difficulties, just avoid picking and choosing. Isn't this just a cliche for people? Again, isn't that just picking in himself? Joshu said, someone once asked me and I really couldn't explain it for 5 years. So that's the other side. Silence. The one I just said was speech is okay. And now Joshu is reminding us here of the silence that's necessary to understand, going beyond words. The words are okay. You do got to go beyond it. I couldn't explain it for 5 years. It can't be expressed. But I think the best one, and the one that's most apropos of what we're talking about today, is the ultimate path has no difficulties as long as you avoid picking and choosing. So the monk asks, what is not picking and choosing? And Joshu quotes the Buddha, basically on his enlightenment, when he says, in the heavens and on earth, I alone am the honored one. I, who? Not Siddhartha Gautama. That sounds like huge egotism, right? But it's not, of course. The I who speaks that, the enlightened one, is the Buddha, is the Christ, is everyone, is everything. Because you're enlightened, you're connected to everything. So obviously you don't pick and choose, because you're everything. What's to pick and choose? So he explained, that's what I mean by that. I alone in heaven and earth am the honored one. There's only Christ. There's only Buddha. And I disappear in that. So I am not picking and choosing anymore. And it's certainly not the inflated ego, saying, I alone am. That's not at all what we're talking about. So once again, when you're connected to everyone and everything, that's your true self. All your personal preferences. It's not about your personal preferences or your compulsive reactions. It's about you and everything. It's about God and everything else. As we began by saying for Richard Rohr. So are we there yet? Well, I'm not there yet. I'm always reminded when I'm in the middle of doing something, trying to manage my day in my office, at the rectory, doing my email, and there's the beeper sounds, and it's the hospital, and there's somebody dying on the 7th floor, and you got to come over right away. So not only am I interrupted, but I got to enter into a whole mindset where I got to go comfort a dying individual and her family. Wow. I prefer not to do that, but it's always better that I do. And I realize when I experience it, I'm into a flow. I just leap into a flow there of something really important that's beyond my own self and certainly beyond my own preferences. But I still have that reaction when I hear the beeper go on. Or when I go to the subway and I'm in a hurry and the train's just pulling out. I won't tell you the 4-letter words that come to my mind. And or when just before coming here, when I over at Starbucks and climbing up, I don't find the seat that I want. Or someone beats me to it. The separate person over there beats me to, the whole nonsense. So let that, if that's any encouragement to you, we're all kind of still fighting the same daily reaction. But as long as we have a clear vision, of what we're really looking for, or no, what's looking for us, who we really are, and how we can allow that surge of the creative energy of the universe to flow through us, to give us enthusiasm, and our own, even the temptation to our own preferences and compulsive reactions begins to disappear. At least we can also begin to experience more and more the flow of what it actually feels like to be in that enthusiasm, to be in that groove, to be in that enthusiasm of the universe within us. So, any comments or questions, reactions?